I'm Allison Arieff. I'm the editorial director of SPUR, which is an urban planning and policy think tank in San Francisco. We've been there over 100 years. We've also just opened an office in Oakland and are celebrating our second year in San Jose. I'm also a contributing columnist, and I write for the New York Times, where I write about cities and design. We're going to be talking today about entrepreneurship in the city. I want to begin with just a little anecdote. I live in San Francisco, which is, of course, sort of ground zero for innovation and entrepreneurship right now. I wrote a rather controversial piece for the Times last year called "Why Are Tech Companies Such Bad Urbanists?" And what was fascinating to me about this article that people hadn't seemed to have really observed much before then is that while it's true that we still have corporate suburban campuses, and it's also true that more and more companies now want to be in cities like San Francisco, what I began to observe is that all these companies are scrambling to be in San Francisco, but once they arrive, they turn into a suburban corporate campus. I mentioned in this article in particular Google, which has taken up residence in the Hills Plaza building, which at one point had about 8 ground floor businesses, which have now been closed and become private Google offices, including a 14,000 square foot yoga studio just for employees. Earlier today, there was mention of Twitter's Skybridge. Twitter moved into the central market district of San Francisco with the promise of stimulating the local economy and really integrating with the neighborhood. The fact that they want to build a Skybridge so they don't have to cross the street and actually have the serendipitous encounters that Tony Hsieh talked about this morning seems to me problematic. So a little bit of what we'll talk about today is what it means for entrepreneurship in the city if people come to the city and then are fed 3 meals a day and actually never leave the building, which seems to me the absolute solution to not have the cultural collisions that Hsieh was talking about this morning, and also really begins to affect the way that problems are framed and solved when the only collisions that you're having are your coworkers, and you're not actually interacting with people outside of your own industry. So we seem to find ourselves in a place like Silicon Valley that's sort of an upper middle class bubble. There's not really an embrace of messy urbanism. Instead, many are looking to apps and algorithms, such as how many people you can have on the street at any time of day as a measure of success of a city. So what does that mean for the future of entrepreneurship? For the local barber, baker, or even barista, what does that mean? When a company like Blue Bottle Coffee, which is a coffee shop in San Francisco, which got $25 million in VC money earlier this year. So today we will talk about the entrepreneurial capacity of cities, a conversation that will cover a broad range of issues from immigrant entrepreneurs to whether or not there is a magic formula for zones of innovation within cities. We'll be hearing from Margaret O'Mara and Mario Small, and we're going to begin with Margaret.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Margaret O'Mara. I'm a associate professor of history from the University of Washington. I'm also a Casbah Fellow this year. And Allison's opening remarks teed up my presentation perfectly. Because what I do is really study the history of how the high-tech industry has grown and the spaces it has inhabited. And so why this sort of migration from city to suburb to city back again, why it's taken on this particular form and what the implications are for urbanism more broadly. So the topic of this panel is the entrepreneur in the city. And when we think of entrepreneur, close your eyes, imagine, conjure up an image, and it probably looks a lot like this, right? If you're sitting here and now in 2014, the idea of the entrepreneur has become really closely correlated with someone who is a creator, an inventor of new technologies. It's a technologist, a software developer, hardware developer. And it's also become, you often talk about entrepreneurship and innovation as one thing. So what I want to talk about is this particular type of entrepreneurship and innovation, and the relationship between innovation, if we define innovation as bringing new ideas into the world, not just invention, but actually the bringing out, the scaling up of the idea, and how that process correlates with urbanity, with cities. So I'm a historian, so I like to go to the deep backstory. So So the software developer Eric S. Raymond famously made the analogy, the cathedral and the bazaar, to talk about proprietary software versus open source software. And so I'd like to appropriate and adapt that a little bit and talk about that when it comes to cities and innovation. So throughout human history, there has been, the places where new ideas have come from have most often been places with urban densities of people, of where there are collisions, where there's serendipitous encounters, where a lot of different people, from a lot of different backgrounds come together. Cities that have been innovative cities through history, from ancient Mesopotamia to contemporary cities of the 21st century, are often international crossroads where different cultures and languages collide. It is a place of messiness, of encounters, of where different ideas come, people are exposed to new ideas and thus break out and come up with something new. But here's another thing that kind of also operates when we think about the connection between innovation and place, and we see this throughout human history, that cities and innovation, another dimension is the cathedral. That in order for knowledge to be generated, there have also been these special institutions that have been created, from Plato's Academy to the medieval cathedral and cloister to the modern university, where people can come together, share ideas, iterate, collaborate, and bring something new into the world. Now, the cathedral is seen as something that's the antithesis of the bazaar, but the two things are urban creations, right? You need an urban agglomeration of wealth to build a cathedral. You need people to build a cathedral. You need people to populate these places of knowledge and to disseminate these places. You need to be close to a city in order to have a receiving end for that knowledge. So we see this sort of the cathedral and the bazaar operating simultaneously when we think about the emergence of the modern university. And I'm going to talk about American history for the rest of my time here, but this also has global repercussions. So America is kind of, at the moment when America, the nation, is coming into being. It's also the moment where the idea of knowledge is becoming, and technology as something that isn't just a utilitarian thing, but something that actually is a mechanism for doing something new and better, is also coming into being. And Ben Franklin's articulation of how his vision for the University of Pennsylvania, a university in Philadelphia, colonial America's most important city, was that it should be, if not in the town, not too many miles from it. So while the Anglo-American model of the campus was something that was removed from the city, it couldn't be too far away from the metropolis. It needed to be close enough to the bazaar to feed on its energy. So these two things were proximate. Now, you have the university, the idea of the campus is something that comes into being with the American college and university. So how does this play out in the private sector, in the corporate sector? How does this play out as America industrializes? Well, what we see in the 19th century is we see the creation of special places for particular types of people. Those of you who are familiar with the history of Chicago are probably also familiar with the history of Pullman, Illinois, created by George Pullman, founder of the Pullman Car Company, as this model company town for his workers. He provided housing, shopping malls. You could do everything in Pullman. Now, why did he do this? Well, he was hailed as a benevolent employer, but it was also because it was a really good way to increase loyalty to the Pullman Company, to decrease the likelihood that the workers would join unions and go on strike. Those of you familiar with the history of Chicago and Pullman know that that did not work, and they actually did go on strike. But this idea of creating model towns for model workers, that an environment can encourage particular types of productivity, is something that's really deeply embedded in the idea of the campus and the idea of the company town. And these two things follow through as we think about spaces of technology as we move from the 19th century to today. So by the beginning of the 20th century, big corporations are creating research arms, industrial research, that the private sector is where research, most of American research happens before the Second World War. And you have facilities like a GE-affiliated, part of GE, what GE called its University of Light, this very elaborate campus that was built in the second decade of the 20th century outside Cleveland. And was kind of this really innovative facility in its day. It looked like a college campus, really, really high-end buildings, Georgian buildings, and had a whole bunch of amenities, recreational facilities, fantastic stuff for its workers. If we talk today about how big tech companies from Google to Facebook to Zappos create all these great amenities for their workers on site, Nela Park was doing it 100 years ago. And this continues on in the middle of the 20th century with the emergence of this suburban research park, the suburban corporate research facility, famously Bell Laboratories in suburban New Jersey, which had features like this sunroom. So it's special places for knowledge workers. And the idea was you needed to create this. This is the cathedral. This is the place where smart people can come together. They can collaborate and have come up with new ideas, but they are somewhat separate from the bazaar, from the hoi polloi. And this is what happens in this place starting about 60 years ago. And what develops here is this entrepreneurial ecosystem that's suburban, that is removed, separate from San Francisco for a very long time, but is really, really robust and highly networked. It's something that, John Seeley Brown called it a knowledge ecology. That it's made up, in a way, it has bizarre qualities, not bizarre, but like the bazaar, in that you have lots of different people with different skill sets, venture capitalists, marketers, lawyers, technologists, university professors, feeding into this ecosystem. And so it's highly networked, highly diverse, but it's also separate from the rest. So then we come to the present day, and the question that is, here we have the return of a predominantly suburban tech sector to urban environments. And here's where all the contradictions and the challenges come in play, and the big questions that we're going to talk about in terms of what does it mean for a city to be entrepreneurial. Because when tech comes to the city, you have a facility like Twitter that in many ways is kind of an updated Pullman. It's a model town for model workers. It's designed to encourage productivity, loyalty, create these great amenities, these great benefits, to retain a particular workforce, and to make them happy. It's also a corporate campus for knowledge workers in that it is trying to attract and retain a really in-demand workforce, where you have a supply-demand imbalance and you want to get the best people and keep them there. But what these large technology companies are doing they are cathedrals, and they're now within the bazaar. And so I want to leave us with a question, which is, if you have to have both the cathedral and the bazaar for innovation to happen, what is a way that the entrepreneur, the tech entrepreneur, can be both part of that, how you can provide that cathedral-like environment, which is necessary, but also integrate with the broader diversity of the city that really is something that spurs a broader-based innovation, entrepreneurship, and creativity in the first place. So I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about, I think you can hear me. What I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is entrepreneurship and urban ghettos. And if that sounds like a very strange topic, maybe recalling Michael Porter from the 1990s might help. You might remember in a very astute article in the Harvard Business Review, Porter wrote about the competitive advantage of inner cities for local entrepreneurs, but also for large companies. And this is an idea that sort of lingered and was actually quite popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, sort of disappeared, and I think it's come back in some contexts, but only very quietly. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about a different kind of entrepreneurship that's not Silicon Valley type entrepreneurship, but as we heard this morning, starting a bakery, or starting a laundry, or starting a restaurant that serves lunch and breakfast. That's a different kind of entrepreneurship that I think is as vital to what's happening to the development of cities as starting a tech startup that's going to go out and be sold to Amazon for $1 gazillion. And what I'm going to do is I'll make a simple point, is that if we are hoping to understand both the constraints and opportunities for entrepreneurship in the city, and particularly in inner city neighborhoods and in high poverty neighborhoods, we're going to need to expand our understanding of what a poor neighborhood is. It's a simple idea. Both in the Porter article and in the work of William Julius Wilson, I think have done together more than just about any pair of people to shape our understanding of what inner city poverty is. It's a very strong idea that high poverty neighborhoods are highly desolate places, like this is Woodlawn in Chicago, just south of the University of Chicago, where William Julius Wilson did a lot of his work, and where Rob Sampson, actually, who's talking just across the street, did a lot of his work, just across the hall, did a lot of his work as well. And the idea is simple. High poverty neighborhoods are sort of desolate areas where the middle class have left over the 1970s and 80s and become sort of this, you can actually sort of see it here, places where there once was, and I don't know if I can get this going, yeah, there once were plots of land where there was building, activity, or there housing, and became depopulated as everybody left the inner cities in the 1970s and 80s, and by the time we reached the 90s, there was this empty now space of opportunity. And this is actually a very powerful image. If you've seen the television show The Wire, you might have sort of heard similar kinds of stories. In fact, William Julius Wilson used to teach a course at Harvard on the show The Wire, and it was sort of a lot of activity, and this was just a couple of years ago because it sort of epitomized a lot of what was happening in the inner city in the United States. Woodlawn, which is the neighborhood you're seeing pictured here, has about a poverty rate of about 35%, which is sort of a classic high poverty neighborhood. It has high unemployment rate. It has a high rate of dependency. Here's another neighborhood that has about the same poverty rate, the same rates of dependency, and the same unemployment rate. This is Central Harlem in New York City. And this is not the gentrifying Harlem, which we know is happening. This is the part of Central Harlem that is still high poverty, where Jeffrey Canada has started the Harlem Children's Zone. Believe it or not, has just about the same poverty rate, and unemployment rate, and dependency rate as this neighborhood. And if you're thinking about sort of constraints and opportunity, the first thing you notice is, of course, there's a lot more people here, and a lot more of other things, as you'll see in a minute. So just to put it in context, this is the number of persons per square mile in Woodlawn and Central Harlem. There are about 9,000 people per square mile in Woodlawn. There are about 85,000 per square mile in Harlem. A lot of things, including, for what it's worth, the Harlem Children's Zone, are a lot more possible in Central Harlem than they are in Woodlawn. Turns out that, and I'll show you in a minute, I think it's a few slides down, if you look at the city of Chicago and the city of New York as a whole, the differences get a little smaller, but they're maintained. But here's sort of part of what we're getting at. So if you look at the number of small establishments per square mile, small establishments means here, any establishment less than 20, having fewer than 20 employees. So restaurants and grocery stores are classic sort of small scale mom and pop shop in one language, small scale entrepreneur in another language, that you see in inner city neighborhoods, particularly among immigrants. I'm putting in pharmacies and gyms and community stores just to give you a sense of the organizational density broadly, not just with respect to mom and pops. And what you're seeing is, of course, there are a lot more of everything per square mile. And this carries across the board. I'm just making it really simple to make it easier to see in the 4 minutes I have left, than in Woodlawn. And of course, this is not surprising. There are more people, and of course, there are going to be more establishments. But what's interesting, and what I hope you remember from this talk, if you remember nothing else, is that whereas that is the number of establishments per square mile, that is actually the number per capita. In Harlem, there are actually also more pharmacies, restaurants, groceries, and community centers per capita than in Woodlawn. Put differently, Woodlawn is actually undersupplied. If you want to think about sort of the old Porter idea of opportunity, there's a lot of opportunity of a particular kind in Woodlawn. There's different kind of opportunity in Harlem, but it's certainly not the same thing. The model, the vision of the city, the vision of how we mobilize opportunity locally in Harlem and in Woodlawn, in Harlem won't work in Woodlawn and vice versa. this is the point I made earlier, which is you look at the population density. By the way, and I'm sort of giving you case studies because case studies are easy to capture, and we've all been in these cities. But during the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about the national level analysis I've done that basically reinforce the point that A, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in the characteristics of poor neighborhoods across the country. And B, as I'll show you also in a minute, population density, high poverty is actually, in general, slightly positively correlated with organizational density in poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods in the city as opposed to negatively correlated, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so population density in neighborhoods as a whole. The last point I'll make in the few minutes I have left is that there's sort of value in looking at this question historically. Of course, a real historian can really look at the question historically, but I just mean in terms of looking at the change over time. So what you're seeing here is simply, what happens if you took all the poor neighborhoods in the city today, in the year 2010, and you compare the population in 2010 to the population in 1970. And you just categorize them all into three categories. Whether the neighborhood today was poor, in part because it gained population, lost population, or stayed the same. Stayed the same just means that the population in 1970 was 10% above or below the population today. And what you're seeing here in Baltimore and Chicago is the classic story that we've seen many times, which is basically these poor neighborhoods were neighborhoods in which the middle class and many other people left and became desolate, just as the pictures of Woodlawn I saw you, became desolate as a result of that loss of population. It turns out that actually, if you look at the data more closely, both in Baltimore and Chicago, the bulk of that population change happened between 1970 and 1990. Okay? Not coincidentally, Chicago is, of course, the single most studied American city, and poor neighborhoods in Chicago are far more studied than poor neighborhoods in just about any city in the world. In fact, I've done research in Chicago poor neighborhoods myself, and the only phrase you hear more often than program fatigue is research fatigue. People are tired of seeing University of Chicago researchers and faculties in the neighborhood studying them all the time. And of course, Baltimore, because of The Wire, is now one of the most well-known, among the most well-known inner city neighborhoods that you see anywhere. But what happens if you look at, say, New York and Boston? What you're seeing is actually quite a bit more diversity in the changes that the neighborhoods we see as poor today have experienced over the last 40 years. And if you see the Sunbelt cities, what you see is actually a completely different kinds of story. The poorest neighborhoods in LA and Houston today are neighborhoods that over the last 40 years gained people, often immigrants, low-income immigrants, who are known by economists and others as having high rates of entrepreneurship. And so the way we think about what it means to do entrepreneurship in the city and what it means to motivate and stimulate the opportunities that are possible in poor ghettos has to be a story in which we think about different places differently, as opposed to a story in which we use this sort of standard imaginary of what it means to be a poor neighborhood as the covering model for what happens elsewhere. And to wrap up, what I'm arguing is that, look, there's something to be said about the idea of revisiting the entrepreneurship in cities, which is, of course, the theme of today's talk, today's panel. Opportunities and concerns are highly diverse, and a key is going to be to find ways of doing maybe in a local way what some people in the audience actually have written on a national and a citywide scale, managing population density and agglomeration with greater sensitivity to the differences in what's local. Thank you very much.